Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and welcome to our show. Uh, as always, if you're new to the show or you've just been watching the show and you have thought about you'd like to like or subscribe or share, now would be a great time to like, share, subscribe, and comment. Randall, what are some ways that people can like, share, subscribe, or comment?
Well, go to our website, chrisandrandall.com, for all the different ways. We have podcasts everywhere. The podcast is everywhere, all the podcasting places. And we're on Facebook. We're on YouTube. So check it out.
Facebook's a great place for a comment. YouTube's a great place for a comment. Or you can email us. Where can you email us at, Randall?
We'll go to our website for the email.
Go to our website, and the website's address is...
There's a link for the email, chrisandrandall.com.
Thank you so much. CHRIS. That's how I like to spell Chris. Today we're dealing with superheroes, something we have not really dealt with in a long time. Have we ever done a show on superheroes, Randall?
I want to say yes, but I can't think of which one it was now.
I can't either, and we're big comic
We did Watchmen.
Fans.
We did a couple shows on Watchmen, so that counts.
That's kind of like, it's a little too highbrow. Today we're not going to do so damn highbrow. Today we are dealing with two of the most popular superheroes, not just in comic books, I would argue, but in pop culture. Neither of them are named Superman. Can you guess? Well, of course, you know the name of the show. It's Batman and Spider-Man. Title of our show today is Batman versus Spider-Man, which, to be really clear, is not Batman versus Spider-Man in the comic book. They actually did, I found this out, two comics, one in 95 and then a sequel in 1997, but we are not actually going to talk. Okay, let's do it really quick. In a fight, who would win, Batman or Spider-Man? All things being equal.
Well, my gut tells me Spider-Man off the top.
And why would you say Spider-Man?
I don't know. It's just like physically, he's just so superior. I mean, he's got the superhero abilities. He's got the spider sense. I mean, if his spider sense is working, I don't know what Batman's supposed to do. I mean, no matter how much preparation, no matter how much, I know that's what you're gonna say. Batman did all this prep.
Evil genius. He not only would he do his prep, but Batman's sneaky. He doesn't play fair. He would find some way of causing Spider-Man to screw up. And he would take him down and win.
Well, I think Spider-Man's Spidey sense would give him the edge.
That's a good question, but
like even when Batman's planning it, Spider-Man would just be like, "What? No, I have a funny feeling that somebody's trying to kill me." So there you go.
Oh well, I guess that's a good point about this show is, folks, if you tuned in to find out that one question, you can go home now because we're not talking about it. We're talking about it as it relates to art and society, pop culture and society. And really, we're talking about American culture a little bit more than world culture. But I will say that Batman and Spider-Man are international stars. They are icons all over the world and have been respectively for 60 and 80 years.
Yeah, that's true.
They are quite large, quite identifiable.
Well,
quite
Batman
iconic.
and Spider-Man, I mean, all these comic book characters, they're international now. I mean, everybody in the world knows what we're talking about here.
But I mean outside
of
Superman, there are no two more better well-known superheroes after Superman. And we'll talk about Superman anyway in a bit, but let's first get to the origin stories, like any good comic book should. Now, I want to talk a little bit about their creators, and I don't... We're going to get into such a shitstorm. I just want to say it right off the bat. Both Batman and Spider-Man have multiple creators. But for just the sake of this discussion, we're going to attribute the creator of Batman as Bob Kane and ignore Bill Finger, the artist, and any other artists like Dick Sprang. And for Stan Lee, we're going to only talk about Stan Lee, and we're going to ignore all about Steve Ditko and all about Jack Kirby, because at the end of the day, it's just not a fight worth having. And also, in my opinion, the two people who are most responsible for birthing these two characters in sentiment and sensibility, if not maybe costume design, is Bob Kane and Stan Lee. Do you know anything about Bob Kane? I
No,
know you know a lot about Stan Lee.
well, everybody knows a lot about Stan Lee, right?
All right. So Bob Kane created the Batman. Bob Kane was born in 1915, grew up in New York City. Uh, he grew up in the era of the Depression. He was the child of Jewish immigrants. He was Jewish. Um, there was a lot of pulp heroes when he was growing up and radio programs. So he was influenced by the Shadow, if you know that character, Zorro, the Phantom. The Phantom was a millionaire with superpower who fought crime. The Shadow wore a veil around his big hat, a shroud, so no one could see him. The radio announcer would go, who stalks terror in the hearts of men? The Scarlet Pimpernel was actually earlier than that. He was a dandy by day who would solve crimes at night. So his alter ego, no one would suspect, a dandy. And of course, Sherlock Holmes was another big influence. Stan Lee is only 7 years younger than Bob Kane, also born in New York City, also Jewish, also born from first generation. His parents were emigres. Here's an interesting little fact I found out about both men. They both went to the same high school.
Wow, that's amazing. In New York.
DeWitt Clinton, which is a pretty good high school in the Bronx. And they both died at Cedars-Sinai here in Los Angeles.
That's weird. They both had a similar life trajectory, huh?
Their life, 20 years, 7 years. Kane was 7 years older. Lee died 20 years later. Lee was married twice. No, sorry, Lee was married once. Kane was married twice. But they're very similar guys. I mean, the sensibilities that shaped them are very, their influences are very similar.
I almost wonder, what external influences were shaping their lives to push them onto similar paths like that. It's really.
I can
strange.
relate because I think about my mom, who was also grew up in the Bronx. Actually, Stan Lee was born not too far from where I was born on the Upper West Side, but he moved to the Bronx. But I can relate with my mom, who was also a first generation Jewish American, and that my mom is considerably younger. Actually, my mom was born the same year Batman came out. So, but there is something about that early generation of first generation American European Jews in New York City that I really think helps shape a lot of what we think about with superheroes. Even Stan Lee talks about how he was influenced by a pulp character named the Spider. It's a bit different because Bob Kane creates Batman at the age of 24 in 1939. And Stan Lee creates Spider-Man at the age of 40 in 1962. Kane is a struggling young writer who's making a living as a freelancer. Stan Lee is the nephew of the publisher of Marvel Comics, who's just been ordered to come up with a new superhero because superheroes are making a comeback. Also, I would say the thing about Lee you got to understand is that Lee, because he was 40, comic books in both scenarios were created for kids. So the distance between Kane and the people he's writing for is not that much. 24 is about 10 years from 14.
Well, Chris, let me get to something you just said that sounded very interesting. So both these men had experience as Jewish immigrants growing up in New York City during the 1930s. They even went to the same high school. You say your own mother comes from a similar background, right?
Yeah.
So, and she was alive during the 30s, right? How old was your mother in the 30s?
My mom was born in 1938, so she's really from a different generation.
Okay, but but so
But
you're
it's a
saying,
common experience. A common
well,
experience.
what do you think? What do you think that experience was?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked. Because, in fairness, this is a good chance to also introduce Joe Simon and Jerry Siegel, who create Superman. Uh, so you really have at the beginning, right after, really at the beginning of the 20th century, prior to World War II, a flood of Eastern European Jews who come to New York City, who have children, and some of these parents are literate and learned people in their own country, and some of them weren't. But all these kids buy into the American dream. They all want to be good Americans. But at that time, it was a very anti Semitic world. And Jews were literally kept as outsiders. There were all sorts of clubs and businesses and schools they were prevented from going to because they were Jews. America was an overtly Christian society. It was an overtly anti-Semitic society. All the icons of success were Christians. The cities, especially New York City during the Depression, had this great, it was interesting because in the 20s, there was a great deal of wealth. And then by the 30s, there'd be a great deal of poverty. So you have these great contrasts between very wealthy cosmopolitan New Yorkers and very poor or very working class immigrants.
Well, can I
I'm
ask you?
hoping I'm painting the picture. But the biggest thing I wanted to say is the sense of being an outsider, which I do think informs Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man.
Could I ask you? Would you mind talking about your background and your name, Chris? I mean, because you've told me this before personally. So you were born what year?
I was born in 1965, even though I'm Jewish. I was named after a Roman Catholic saint. So that gives you a sense of assimilation and how important assimilation was to Jews of that period of history.
Both your parents were Jewish.
Yeah.
And you have family members who died in the Holocaust. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And your parents gave you a very Christian name, and they didn't send you to the, what is it, the temple, the Jewish temple?
I was not. I was raised by secular Jews.
Okay, but your parents wanted you to assimilate. They gave you every opportunity to assimilate, right? They didn't want you to.
I mean, I'm from a different generation though than Stan Lee and Bob Kane, where
True, but
it was much more. Go ahead.
True, but I mean, your own experience speaks to the anti-Semitism you're speaking of, right? Just how much your parents wanted you to assimilate and fit in and appear to be a good Christian or give you the chance to, right?
Well, that's a great point. I mean, one of the reasons why people asked Bob Kane, why did he make Batman Bruce Wayne so wealthy is because he grew up poor and he always thought it'd be great to be a wealthy man. And that was an idealized version of the American dream, to be this patrician, wealthy man who lived at the top. Which is interesting because Stan Lee, when he creates Peter Parker, he's really coming out of a completely different world. He's coming out of the baby boom of a period of affluence. Even though Stan Lee is living in Long Island, which is at that time was a fairly middle-class Jewish haven, he puts Peter Parker in Queens, which is a slightly more blue-collar, but also adjacent borough to Long Island that is fairly Jewish and fairly ethnic. I do find it fascinating that both men were obsessed with the two polarities,
And, it is interesting to me, too, that you're talking about this immigrant Jewish experience they both had, and neither of them made explicitly Jewish characters. I mean, you would think, there is something today, right? We have this identity politics where if you're a content creator, you're going to make characters who are your identity, right? They're your religion, they're your ethnicity. But these two men made characters who were part of the mainstream group, so to speak, right?
Yes. And but the thing that keeps the Judaism, I would argue, whether they care to deal with it or not, is a couple of themes. One is that of the outsider, but also just a moral code. I mean, Judeo-Christian values, or we can even expand it to Abrahamic values, are fairly similar. But, originally Hashem, as we like to refer to him, was a war god, a god of vengeance, a god who's vigilant and watching. So I would argue that in some senses, you're dealing with a lot more with Old Testament morality in the moral universes of Batman and Spider-Man than you're dealing with Christian morality in them. And let's go really now into the characters to kind of help illustrate the point. Let's talk about their origin stories. It's interesting that they both are orphans at a fairly early age. Peter Parker's a bit confusing because when we meet him before he's a superhero, he's being raised by his aunt and his uncle, and he's 15. So he already has lost his parents at some point in his early childhood, but it's never made explicitly clear. Whereas Bruce Wayne becoming an orphan at 8 is essentially the essence of his origin. But both of their origins really involve the murder of family members.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, Kane
it's a fairly violent.
Say that that was deliberate. He wanted the most traumatic experience he could.
Well, again, we're talking about they both coming of age in 1930s New York, which I think is, I mean, if you read some of the classic Batman and Spider-Man stuff, you do get a sense that the streets of the city are crime-ridden.
Yeah.
And full of mayhem and criminals and just, I mean, 1930s New York, I think was like that.
I mean, they're both murdered by robbers. They are both murdered by robbers. They're not murdered by supervillains. There's no elaborate act of betrayal. There's no magical villainy. It's just a simple robbery that went south. They weren't even murdered they were murdered almost just because they failed to be good victims of a robbery.
Yeah, and the American crime rate is very low compared to historical precedent today. And I think a lot of people who would look at the origin stories of Batman and Spider-Man, they would think, well, these are extraordinary crimes. But I think that when these stories were conceived, these were just commonplace everyday crimes.
I would honestly say, because it's of the 60s and that particular era, the odds of being murdered by a burglar in 1962 were not that high. The rate of violent crime was seriously tapered off by that period of history, whereas in the 1930s, that certainly would be the case. But keep in mind that part of the paradox of Peter Parker is that it's a guy born in the Depression writing his version of what it would be like to be a young person in the 60s. So he's still referencing a 1930s world of crime when he thinks about the murder of Uncle Ben. And, it's interesting because both of them are victims of street-level crime. They both Spider-Man and Batman are formed really as street-level heroes. Superman is not really a street-level hero. Superman is a guy who takes on, the Brainiac 5. I'm sorry, Brainiac, and, an alien who collects other planets. Or he does take on Lex Luthor, but Lex Luthor is not a street-level villain. He's a corporate genius,
But don't you think, isn't early Superman more of a street-level brawler?
No, he takes on social justice and he fights capitalists. But even then, it's still on a slightly bigger spectrum than, Metropolis is a clean city, and most of the things that it has to deal with are on a bigger level, whereas Gotham is a dirty city that needs cleaning up. New York City of Stan Lee's world is not as dark and dreary as Gotham, but it still falls prey to, all sorts of robbers. And again, I will say that both Batman and Spider-Man today have long outgrown their urban level, but it's interesting that they both choose, a bat and a spider to identify with. I mean, it's almost you could almost argue it's kind of the opposite of being a Superman, right? It's a superlative. He's a Superman, but like a Batman is to strike fear. And I've always felt like a Spider-Man. I guess people fear spiders, right? So they're both, bats and spiders. These are creatures that are ugly.
We're getting to a major difference between the two. I mean, Batman chooses a bat, but for Spider-Man, the spider chooses him, right? Spider-Man.
Yes, and I really want to get into that in just one moment when we talk about how that plays out. But you're right. It's the difference between fate, right? Do we choose our fate, or does our fate fall on us? You're right. And Batman, he chooses a bat because he observed a bat and he wants to strike fear. Whereas you're right, Spider-Man is just bitten by a spider.
Spider-Man, well, we'll see this as we talk, but yeah, Spider-Man just he's a kid that's born on the waves of fate. He doesn't make many choices for himself.
But I think if we could get back to that in just a moment, because I want to just talk about one of the defining commonalities that they both have, and then let's relate to what you just said, which is they're both defined by the paradox of being extraordinary and vulnerable, as opposed to Superman, who is just simply extraordinary. Does that make any sense? In other words, Superman has a super brain, and he's got super strength and super speed and super vision. He's indestructible, and he's a superior being.
We didn't bring this up, but we should have in the beginning. But Superman is one of the first superheroes, quote unquote, and they sort of threw everything into him. And as the years went on, they gave him even more stuff. So like when Superman first started, he could only jump over buildings. He could jump really high, and then eventually he could fly.
But he could lift a car. He had X-ray vision. He's an alien. He's not even one of us.
They made and they made bullets bounce off of him.
Yeah.
They made his X-ray vision into like laser beams that shoot out of his eyes. I don't even know if they've ever defined what's going on with his eyes, but it's.
Whereas I think the things and this I just want to get to this before we talk about what you just said about how they relate to their sense of calling, is that the thing that they both share, Bruce Wayne and Peter Parker, Batman and Spider-Man, is that they're human beings.
And I just want to
being is that. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to add that I do not believe that Spider-Man or Batman have been added to over the years. Spider-Man started with a set of abilities.
They've both been overwritten to death. All of these comic book characters have. It's frightening, but we're not gonna. Folks, and actually you bring a great point. Yeah, there's a lot of updates to the Superman, Spider-Man, and Batman that we're talking about that we're not going to cover. We're really going with the most well-established versions of all of these characters. So to be clear, we're talking about a Batman with no superpowers, who is the world's greatest detective, a master of disguise, a gadgeteer.
Right. I'm just saying that I don't think. So Batman's a good example. Like, I don't think they've ever given him like kind of any super ability, right? He's never acquired a super ability over the years.
Only for one shot, only for, an alternative world. You're absolutely right.
And Spider-Man has never really acquired more super abilities. I mean, maybe you could argue a couple, but they've never really stuck, right?
Exactly. Look, Spider-Man has an actual superpower, which Batman does not have. But and I want to get to that in a moment. But at their core,
but your point is they're vulnerable. They're not overpowered like Superman.
And they're human beings. They have the limitations psychologically and physiologically. They will get old. They will age at a normal rate. They have psychological issues, vulnerabilities. They're both. If you stripped Spider-Man from his superpower, I think it's fair to say that he and Batman are both guided by their sense of duty and their intellect.
Mm-hmm.
And their intelligence really informs a lot. But, Now let's get to what you were saying about the differences, because it is such a big difference to be a man, even like Peter Parker, who does have an unnatural ability to. He has some level of super strength. He has the ability to stick to walls, and he has this advanced sense of warning. His spider senses, his spider webs. It's sometimes different, but originally his spider webs were something that he creates intellectually, and it's a gadget. I know for some of you who only know Spider-Man through the movies, they have the webs come out of his wrists, but that's really not canon. But you were saying about their sense of duty being different, that one is chosen and one is fated. So elaborate more. I'm really curious.
Well, I mean I think that's a quite obvious difference. I mean, Batman chooses to become Batman. I mean, he very much consciously makes the choice, and he has many years to think about it. He never had to be Batman. He just decided one day to be Batman, and most of his origin stories show him training over many years to become Batman. Now, Spider-Man, on the other hand, resists becoming Spider-Man. I think in the comic book origin story, he originally decides to use his newfound superpowers. His superpowers, they just accidentally come to him because he's accidentally bitten by a radioactive spider.
Yeah.
And he decides to use the superpowers to make money. He decides to become a professional wrestler. And then there's a horrible crime that he could have prevented, and he decides that with great power comes great responsibility.
Well, let me slow you down, because this is so seminal. I think it's worth breaking down. So, 8-year-old Bruce Wayne goes to see The Mask of Zorro with his father and mother. After the movie is over, a man tries to rob his father with a gun. The robber shoots his mother and father in front of him, and young Bruce Wayne decides to dedicate the rest of his life, all of his money and all of his capacity, to mastering everything he has to master in order to become a crime fighter. He sees a bat and draws his his avatar, essentially an avatar from the bat, because the bat is scary and it strikes fear. Whereas Spider-Man, you're right, Peter Parker is just randomly bitten by a radioactive spider at a science fair where he is showing off his web sticking equipment. Don't think too hard on this. Please do not think too hard on this.
It's an accident.
It's an accident. But anyway, he gets his power. He becomes very cocky with it. He decides to become a masked wrestler. The guy who runs the wrestling thing cheats him out of some money. So when the wrestling manager gets robbed, Spider-Man lets the robber go through because, screw you, buddy. Why not? And then later on, that robber kills his Uncle Ben in a robbery. And in that, Spider-Man learns the causality of his actions and what kind of society comes from it. So I would just say that at a very early point, Batman is guided by vengeance and Spider-Man is guided by responsibility. And there's this wonderful, I just wanted to read this because this just really, I felt like nailed it so well. There was a documentary. No, here, in the very first issue of the Batman, and this really kind of sums up what you're talking about here, his credo. Bruce Wayne says, or Batman says, I have a disguise. Criminals are superstitious, cowardly lot. So my disguise must be able to strike terror into their hearts. I must be a creature of the night, black, terrible, Bat. Bruce Wayne, Detective Comics, 33, November 3rd, 1939. So that particular vengeance, and actually it's really interesting when I think about like a war god, like Hashem, it's really there. You know what I'm saying? You know, this is the same God that killed all the firstborn Egyptian males. Are you with me on that one? And it gets really good because there's this quote. So there was a television documentary called Batman Unmasked about the psychology of the character. And the behavioral scientist Benjamin Carney notes that Batman's personality is driven by Bruce Wayne's inherent humanity. That Batman, for all its benefits and for all of the time Bruce Wayne devotes to it, is the ultimate tool of Bruce Wayne's efforts to make the world better. Bruce Wayne's principles include the desire to prevent future harm and vow not to kill. Bruce Wayne believes that our actions define us. We fail for a reason, and anything is possible. And that's a very particular moral code, right? But let's look at, it's interesting, right? So that's like traditional Batman moral code. Do you think I've got that right? Do you think there's anything you want to add on the traditional Batman moral code? I'm going to find the killer of my parents. I'm going to make sure other people aren't, going to be orphaned.
Yeah, that sounds about it. I mean, I don't think Batman. I don't think in any of the Batman stories he ever expects to find the killer of his parents. Like, there's no actual.
Oh, he did find the killer of his parents. He got his revenge. That's part of the canon now.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that used to not be part of the canon, but okay.
It's gone back and forth. Originally, it really wasn't. I mean, in fairness, I think same thing with Peter Parker finding the guy who killed Ben.
You know what? I kind of like it not being part of the I kind of like it not being part of the canon. Because it makes Batman a little bit more noble. But yeah, I get it.
It's inconsequential, though. Is the truth, right? I mean, whether they ever found the killer of their parent or not, or the killer of Uncle Ben.
Well, I guess it depends. What happens after he finds the killer? Does he keep being Batman or does he retire?
No, the point being, though, that Batman has this obsession. He has to bring people to justice because he was helpless, right? He was helpless. As a child, he was helpless to defend his parents.
Well, he doesn't want but he doesn't want what happened to him to happen to other people. He's trying to make the world a better place for everybody. I mean, it's fairly noble, I think.
Right, but he also has a sense of what it's like to be helpless, right? Which gives him empathy and vulnerability because he doesn't want to be helpless. But Peter Parker, not so much. He was not helpless. Peter Parker was irresponsible. Peter Parker was selfish. Peter Parker didn't think about anyone but himself. So I like this one because when we think... Oh, go ahead. You were going to say something.
I was going to say, yeah, Peter Parker is guilted and shamed into being a superhero.
Well, which is such a different motivation. So I looked up this quote, which really... Okay, so... With great power, there must also come great responsibility. Alternatively known as the Peter Parker principle, a proverb popularized by Spider-Man comic book written by Stan Lee, clearly conceptually dating back during the French Revolution, this formulation is the original version of this phrase appears in a narrative caption of the comic's last panel, rather than spoken as dialogue. It reads, "With great power, there must also come great responsibility." So,
what were you saying? What's the origin of the phrase?
The French Revolution is what it's been dated to, but no one knows specifically. So it is, and again, another kind of Judaic moral here, because it's what happens when you go back to Moses and the people who created the golden calf. When you turn your back on responsibility, when you turn your back on being part of a community, when you take your gifts and you don't use them, then there is a consequence. It's guilt. If you really think about it, one of them is driven by vengeance and one of them is driven by guilt. And that's so interesting to me, I mean, if you look at Batman, right, Bruce Wayne is a mature, emotionally controlled, wealthy man with few personal attachments, right? I mean, in a way, he's idyllic, right?
Idyllic? You mean for a superhero?
Yeah, because he's impervious. You know what I'm saying? He's all brain, very little feeling, very little rage. He's got it under control. I mean, isn't he like... I would almost argue he's like the anal retentive superhero.
Well, he's kind of like He's kind of like the monk superhero. He's devoted his life to one thing, crime fighting, and his entire life has been completely. His entire life's constructed just to fight crime,
Right.
like every aspect of his life.
But
and
keep in mind, he's a wealthy monk, so he can afford to be a monk.
right. And Spider-Man, though, on the other hand, he would rather not fight crime, but he feels the responsibility to. He feels he's guilted and shamed into it, so he devotes a tiny portion of his life, like his day job, his temporary job, into fighting crime, and the rest of his time is devoted to just trying to have a normal life. I mean, Spider-Man wishes he could have a normal life, but he can't because he got bit by a radioactive spider.
But in his early years, he has to, because when Uncle Ben dies, he has to get a job as a photographer at the Daily Bugle to help pay the bills, and he still has to do his homework in high school so he can get into college. Spider-Man is all about juggling, right? Like, if you think about it, Peter Parker is Spider-Man, but if he stopped being Spider-Man, he'd still be a student, a nephew, a kid who had, well, I don't know what he'd take photos of anymore, but he'd still have to support himself. He'd have a full life full of all sorts of stuff. But if Bruce Wayne stopped being the Batman...
Well, you kind of see that difference in the comics. Like, in some of the Spider-Man stories, there is some obsession with trying to find out who Spider-Man is, like unmasking him. But in the Batman stories, I don't think there's as much of a desire to find out who Batman is, because it doesn't matter as much. Batman he's Batman.
But what an interesting... I mean, think about it. What an interesting contract, right? Because Batman's goal is to strike fear, and Spider-Man's strength is his sense of danger. It's his ability to actually fear things that is his superpower.
Well, in a sense,
the ability to fear.
Well, in a sense, Spider-Man, Peter Parker has the luxury of not devoting his entire life to being a superhero, because he does have the superpowers. He does have Spidey sense. I mean, because of Spider-Man's Spidey sense, he could kind of relax all the time. I mean, he senses danger before it hits him.
But he's not a relaxed guy. I mean, he is a middle-class kid, a flawed superhero with everyday problems, versus Batman, who has, to my knowledge, no everyday problems, and is it's really fascinating to think of it this way, but Kane creates, at the age of 24, an ideal middle-aged wealthy man. And at the age of 40, Stanley creates an awkward working-class teenage kid. And the Kane is projecting what he thinks a successful grown-up should be, and slightly waspy, to be honest with you. And
slightly, you mean all the way waspy?
All the way waspy, right? And Lee is looking back on his own youth, trying to imagine what it would be like to be a DeWitt Clinton high school kid today in the 60s. But, and it's funny,
if you read the early Spider-Man books, it's like, he's trying to make a hip with it 60s kid, right?
But he's using his own personal experiences, and that's the key. And that's what makes Spider-Man so interesting, is that he is really... but he's grounded in reality. In fact, there's a really great quote. I think now is a good time to get into the quotes about the psychology. Sally Kempton wrote something that I find is a little crazy, but I'm going to read it. In 1965, in the Village Voice, she says, "Spider-Man has a terrible identity problem, a marked inferiority complex, and a fear of women. He is antisocial, castration-ridden, racked with Oedipal guilt, and accident-prone, a functioning neurotic. Agonizing over his choices, always attempting to do right, he is nonetheless viewed with suspicion by authorities who seem unsure as whether he is helpful vigilante or a clever criminal." What do you think of Miss Kempton's take?
Well, yeah, I agree with you. It's a little out there, but it's funny because a lot of the language she uses, I think, is very very stylish for the time. So castration-ridden, identity problem, inferiority complex. These are like buzzwords from that era. But
it's the same way we would treat Batman too. She could have just as easily said about Batman.
These buzzwords have very little actual meaning, I
But the
feel.
cultural historian, I think Bradford W. Wright, really, I think nails it. Let me read this, and I really think this speaks to what where we're heading to next. Uh, from his high school beginnings to his entry into college life, Spider-Man remained the superhero most relevant to the world of young people. Fittingly, then, his comic book also contained some of the earliest references to politics of young people. In 1968, in the wake of an actual militant student demonstrations at Columbia University, Peter Parker finds himself in the midst of similar unrest at his Empire State University. Peter has to reconcile his natural sympathy for the students with his assumed obligation to combat lawlessness as Spider-Man. As a law-upholding liberal, he finds himself caught between militant leftism and angry conservatives. And that is really interesting to me because Spider-Man really is the quintessential young man as hero, right? In our grounded reality. And I would argue Batman, Bruce Wayne, is really the quintessential dad who lives more in the world that we either imagine being, is it either a wish fulfillment or a nightmare? But not really our world, right? He's a projection of our hopes and our fears when we get older.
Batman.
You think that's true? You Batman.
Well, I'd have to think about it, but yeah, it's an interesting point, Chris.
I think that's the difference between DC Comics and Marvel Comics, because in Marvel Comics, and Stan Lee, who creates Spider-Man, is responsible for the majority of Marvel Comics, and Spider-Man really sets the style for contemporary Marvel Comics in that it's what if a very regular guy got an extraordinary gift and still had to live in the real world. Whereas, as we've just said before, Bruce Wayne is the alter ego of Batman, but DC worlds, I would argue, are expressionistic, right? They're the ultimate embodiment of good and evil. Whereas,
right. So this is a point you've made to me many times in our discussions.
Yeah.
You say to me that DC is about the gods and Marvel is about humans. Although I would say because of the superpowers that Marvel heroes have, they're more like the Titans, right, or the demigods.
Yeah.
But yeah,
but
there you
that's
go.
true. The Greek gods had humanistic appetites, which would often be their undoing, or they'd have fatal flaws. But I still think that at the end of the day, Marvel heroes are more vulnerable, and therefore they are more human, and they live in a world where the physics look more like our own. And at their most, they are psychological manifestations. You know, Peter Parker is defined by his insecurity, and it's fair to say that Batman is defined by his obsession with fighting crime. But he's still, I would argue, an expressionistic hero, that he lives in an emotionally expressionistic universe where there is almost an operatic level of evil and good, innocence and virtue.
Well, yes. Well, the funny thing about Batman, I would like to say, is that even though he's DC, he is kind of a god. He's a man who made himself into a god.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. In my research, I found out that he speaks 40 languages and he's learned 127 different combat techniques. Like, that's insane. No one speaks 40 languages. No one studied 127 different forms of combat.
Yeah, he's a little. I mean, they've made him a little bit more superpowered over the years. I mean, he still doesn't have any actual superpowers, but they keep making. Batman is the pinnacle of human perfection, right?
Yeah.
No one could ever be better than him in anything.
I mean, in that sense, that's really the big difference. So let's talk about their relationships, because I think we don't really talk, when we talk about heroes, we rarely talk about their relationships, which is a real shame because human beings are defined by their relationships, by who they care about. I think it's really fascinating that both of them have a mentor step parent, in that Batman is guided by his butler, Alfred Pennyworth, who acts kind of as a foster father, mentor. And then Peter Parker has his Aunt May.
Yeah, they're both kind of weak ties, I think.
Oh, no, I disagree. They both care deeply about them. But keep in mind, Aunt May, for the most time, never knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, and Alfred always knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman.
Well, I see them as weak ties because, like you said, Spider-Man, Aunt May doesn't know everything about Spider-Man, doesn't know everything about his life. They don't. I mean, they're close, but not that close. And with
I don't
Alfred,
think there's anyone closer. I think that both characters have the strongest love for those two people.
well, that just makes it sad. But
Well, but no, I mean, but what's the role of a mentor parent to a superhero? I think we can learn a lot by it, right? Because if you look at Alfred, he seems so businesslike in his relationship to Master Bruce. He accepts the oddity of Batman's world.
well, I feel that most of the stories, the Alfred Batman relationship, Alfred, he knows his place. His place as a servant. I mean, he doesn't have the ability to forbid Batman from going out and doing something super dangerous. I mean, Batman's just going to do it. He's just there to clean him up at the end.
Well, but he's more than just that. No, I disagree. He's a mentor, but he's a mentor to him who accepts that this is the role that he has taken, that he has going to be a costume vigilante, and this is the world he's going to pursue. So he's going to make sure that his uniforms are crisp, that there's food on the table, that he has his painkillers to the ready, that the computers are clean and efficient.
Well, if you're right, Batman, Bruce Wayne, his only actual relationship in the world is with Alfred.
But Alfred is emotionally aloof. Whereas if you look at Aunt May knows nothing really of superheroics, but she's very intuitive. And she really manages the emotional life of young Peter. She understands his feelings better than he does. She looks after him. She is concerned that he takes care of himself. It's quite the opposite relationship if you think about it. Whereas Alfred really helps Bruce manage the business of being Batman, I would argue that that Aunt May is the one who keeps Peter tethered to being a human being. Even when she finds out that he is Spider-Man, she is always insisting that he takes care of the responsibilities of his normal human life.
Yeah, I can see they both have similar roles in these people's lives, in Batman, Spider-Man's lives.
Let's look at the romantic relationships between Bruce and Peter.
Batman, he only has the one relationship with Alfred. I mean, most of his romantic relationships are like they're just cover for his Batman character, right?
Oh no, that's the Bruce. No, I mean Batman has he's been romantically involved with Catwoman, Talia al Ghul.
Are those real relationships though? I mean, what aren't those like all screwed up?
Children with both of them.
Really? Okay, I haven't read those stories.
Yeah, I mean, but his type of woman is normally dangerous women, and it's unstable relationships. And for the most part, you never expect whoever he's involved with romantically to be around for very long. And he never picks normal women. I mean, he does every so often, but the Vicky Vales tend to be so unimportant. And almost it feels to me like he's best known for having sex than for being in love. By the very fact that he's actually had 2 kids by 2 different dangerous villainous women. He's also is part of this thing where he's only attracted. Wonder Woman is the only hero I know that he's ever been romantically linked to, and even there, it's never really dealt with in any serious manner.
Well, he's not interested in being a normal person. Okay, so he's only interested in being Batman. I mean, Spider-Man wants to have a normal life. Why don't you talk about Spider-Man?
He's dated a number of women, but he has had 2 great loves. His first great love was the girl that he fell in love with in college, Gwen Stacy. And the second great love is Mary Jane Watson, who he marries. In fact, it's interesting, Mary Jane was originally recommended to him by Aunt May, who thought they would be a good match. But Gwen Stacy, this is so interesting because he had given him a few girlfriends in high school before he got up to Gwen Stacy, but Gwen was his first serious relationship. And in the comic books, they were concerned that the way they were going, they would have to marry him off to Gwen. And in the early 70s, they thought you really couldn't have a married man be a superhero. So the writers at Marvel decided they had to kill off Gwen Stacy in order to keep Spider-Man relatable. So the Green Goblin kidnaps Gwen and holds her over the Brooklyn Bridge. And basically, Spider-Man has to choose between rescuing people or rescuing Gwen. And at the last minute, he rescues the people, but he takes his web to keep Gwen from falling when the Green Goblin releases him. And I've always thought that it was the Green Goblin that killed Gwen Stacy. Do you know what killed Gwen Stacy?
What?
The whiplash that she experienced from the web that Peter Parker used to rescue her.
That's pretty sad.
And that's in the comic, right? So it's the second great epic tragedy of Peter Parker, right? Is he actually kills the woman he loves.
Well, that again, that's an accident. I mean, it just shows.
Accident.
I mean, Peter Parker, his life is so much. There's so much luck involved in the Spider-Man story, and I like that they keep that theme going.
Yeah,
Batman.
In fact, he becomes romantically involved with Mary Jane only after becoming. He's so messed up that Mary Jane becomes his friend, and after their friendship evolves, eventually it becomes romantic. But originally, she's just there to help him pick up the pieces.
Right. Well, I like how they keep that theme going. There's so much luck involved in Peter Parker's life. I mean, Peter Parker's a normal person. That's the idea. In normal people's lives, there's so much chance involved in our lives. Batman, he abhors chance. Batman has already thought out every single possibility and created a contingency for it.
Peter Parker is, unfortunately, I hate to say, like, Batman is sexy. I've known women who go, man, I find Batman sexy. I've literally heard women tell me this. Peter Parker is never really considered sexy. Peter Parker is like, he's the nice guy,
He's normal.
He's the family
He's nerdy.
Man. In every variation of Peter Parker, he always ends up getting married and having kids and being a really responsible dad and retiring from superheroing. That's like, it's in his DNA. I mean, it's interesting too, because Batman has wards that he mentors, whereas Spider-Man looks up to adults. There's a Robin, there's been several Robins, whereas we think it's Spider-Man, he looks up to Tony Stark, Iron Man, he looks up to Captain America. Batman on a team is often the leader, but he's always suspicious of his fellow teammates. He's always coming up with a master plan to kill every single member.
Well, he has to think of every contingency. See, Batman doesn't appreciate luck. He doesn't want to give luck a fighting chance.
Yeah, whereas Spider-Man is just the opposite, right? He's a follower. He puts his faith and his trust in whoever he believes in on that team. He believes in the best of everybody, and I would argue, while he may not be a leader, he tends to inspire people to become part of his group.
Well, the funny thing about Spider-Man is he has this luxury because he has the Spidey sense. I mean, if anybody ever tries to betray Spider-Man, he sees it coming.
Yeah, but he's not confident that way. He is not confident. He is so not confident. He has that, but he doesn't ever rest on it. That doesn't put him at ease. You know what I'm saying? In a way, it's like just having a really terrible anxiety disorder where instead of being paranoid, you're just highly prophetic.
Well, he's a normal person. He is anxious about the things normal people are anxious about. He's a little bit more anxious than a normal person, perhaps. But yeah, his Spidey sense really only kicks in when he's about to be killed. So...
But it's just interesting because on a team, he doesn't like to take the lead. And on a team, instead of trying to figure ways of killing his members, he's just trying to constantly trust that whoever he's on a team with will be there for him. Well, it's really... Go ahead.
I just want to say, the funny thing about Spider-Man, he's not a mastermind. He's an intelligent person, but he's not really... He's not a super genius like Superman or Batman.
Well, actually, now they've made him a genius, so I wish I could say that wasn't true. But like a great example of this is Peter Parker has friends. Peter Parker has a girlfriend, an aunt, co-workers, a boss.
He's got a normal life.
Boss. He's got responsibilities to his boss, to the school, to his employer. He's got his buddies. And then, it's interesting too, because, one of his greatest villains, the Green Goblin, is Norman Osborn. And Norman Osborn's the dad of his best friend, Harry Osborn. And in time, Harry, his best friend, will become one of his greatest villains, the Green Goblin too. So there is even like personal connections. Whereas in Batman, until you get into the modern era, Batman has no relationship with the Joker personally. There are no people from his world that he's going to have to eventually fight. They both fight animalistic or scientific villains, but their villains are both similar and different. Who is your favorite? Just name me like two of your favorite Batman villains.
Well, I think I already told you pre-discussion that Superman was my favorite Batman villain.
Okay,
I thought that was
outside of Superman.
That's always been my favorite. Whenever he fights Superman. Out of evil villains with Batman, oh geez, this is a tough one. Outside of Superman, it's tough. I mean, the Joker's always been to me like too one note as a villain. I mean.
Well, I really like the Joker, so I'm going to pick on the Joker versus Green Goblin for a second, right? The Joker is full-on committed to villainry. He's iconically evil and crazy and wears very elaborate stage makeup and identifies with a card. Whereas the Green Goblin just wears a green freaking mask, has his bombs, his technology. I mean, technologically speaking, I think the Joker is better. I think he's smarter, he's more evil. But as you say, Green Goblin seems to be driven by something that feels a little more grounded than the Joker, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the Green Goblin, more interesting than the Joker? Yeah, sure. I mean, I think most characters are more interesting than the Joker. I mean, I know that a lot of people like the Joker, but...
I mean, they both go after the people in their heroes' lives. They're both sadists, they're both cruel. They're both greedy, they're both vengeful, and they're both unhinged. But
Joker, well, Joker is like a mirror image of Batman. Batman just devotes his whole life to being a crime fighter, and Joker devotes his whole life to being a butt, to making people's lives horrible. But
go ahead.
But that makes it not that interesting, I feel. Ra's al Ghul, right? Do you remember Ra's al Ghul?
He is one of my favorite villains of all time.
So we both agree on that. We both like that guy.
I asked John Byrne, the comic book writer who has worked for Marvel and DC, if he could choose one DC villain to bring to the Marvel universe, who would it be? He said, I would love to write a team up with Ra's al Ghul and Doctor Doom called The Day Evil Won. In fact, in the Spider-Man team up, they did a sequel in '97. Ra's al Ghul teams up with one of my favorite Spider-Man villains, the Kingpin.
Yeah, the Kingpin's great.
So Ra's al Ghul gives the Kingpin's wife cancer and blackmails the Kingpin to say that only if the Kingpin does what Ra's al does, follows his orders, he will give his wife some formula from the Lazarus pit that will cure of her cancer. I mean, and in that moment, you really see the difference between Marvel villains and DC villains, right? Because Ra's al Ghul, his motivation is that humans are a threat to the planet, and he is the ultimate eco-terrorist. But he's willing to just go do what, by all means necessary. Whereas Wilson Fisk, you could never see him do that, could you?
Maybe not.
Not that he's a good man. He's a horrible person. But he does have a slightly more grounded sense of principles. And in the end of the story, Batman and Spider-Man end up getting the formula to give to Fisk's wife so that Fisk doesn't have to worry about that. And Fisk doesn't even go to jail, just...
Well, Ra's al Ghul is great because he's a mastermind. He's one of the greatest masterminds, evil villains in any of these comic books. How do you say his name? How am I saying his name right?
Who knows how to say it? He was created in the 1970s. He's actually one of the more modern villains.
He's a great villain. He's a great
He's an
villain.
immortal. He's the head of the Assassins League.
He's part of a secret society. Yeah, it's great.
This actually, we haven't even talked about this yet, and this is probably the point to talk about is let's look at their relationship, Batman and Spider-Man, to be clear, and not the other characters, Peter Parker and Bruce Wayne. Let's look at their relationship to law and order.
Okay.
I mean, they're both costume vigilantes. So on the surface, you'd have to say they're in opposition to the police in laws, but they also work with the police. They also work with the legal system. So where did they fall, and did they fall in separate places, do you think?
Well, they're both vigilantes, right? So you agree with that?
Yeah.
Which makes them both extra legal. It's like the law is not enough, so they step in, and it's a very like I guess it's a very it's an idea that society is too far gone for law to do anything. So you need these vigilantes to step in and restore order. So they're both about order, but not law.
They always do tie them up. They never kill them. They always tie them up and leave them for the police to pick them up.
Well, this is a.
So they do believe in the legal system. Both characters do.
Well, they're about restoring order, but they believe that you can't restore order by following the law, right? I don't know. Are they breaking laws? You know what? This is an interesting question. I don't think,
well,
how many laws do these superheroes violate?
It gets really complicated because, clearly Bruce Wayne or Batman works closely with Commissioner Gordon. Gwen Stacy's dad was actually a police captain, but there are a couple other police captains and detectives in both of their worlds. So in general, those characters every so often they're wanted by the police, right? They're framed or they have to run away from the police. But I think the biggest difference is that Spider-Man, there was this in the Marvel comics about 10 years ago, they came up with the idea of a hero registration act where all costume vigilantes had to register with the government. And some of the superheroes like Captain America balked, and it led to a civil war. But Spider-Man had no problem saying, I'm Peter Parker, I'll get registered, I'll follow the government. Because I think Parker is someone who puts his faith in authority, whether it's right or wrong. Whereas if you ever read any of the alternative universes, like there's one called Born Under a Red Sun, where Superman is raised in the Soviet Union and becomes a despot, or The Dark Knight Returns. And in both of those stories, Batman is a vigilante wanted by the authority, wanted by the police, who has no problem fighting fascism. It's weird to think of it this way, because you would think that Batman is a fascist. And I will say this, in my opinion, conservatives, Trump followers, thank you again for listening. Most of the people I know who are fans of Batman, who are grown-ups, tend to be on the right. Most of the people I know who are fans of Spider-Man tend to be on the left. I would really love to meet this like super conservative with that what's that weird blue thing that the people are now putting up, the flag to show their support for the cops. You know what I'm talking about?
No.
Anyway, there's some weird flag now there to show your support for the police. I rarely have ever seen those people be fans of Spider-Man. So it's very strange that on some level, Batman in real life would probably be far more to the left of center. His followers are to the right.
I can see why.
Vice versa.
I can see why, because there are certain characters like Ra's al Ghul and Batman and who else? I can't think of anybody right now. But there's certain characters, they have like this overarching idea of how civilization should be organized. They're like masterminds, right? And they want to reorganize civilization to be different, to be better. And I don't know, you could call them utopians maybe. And Batman's one of these people. He has an overarching idea of how society should be organized, and that's his whole life's devoted to changing civilization to be in his vision. So, but Spider-Man's not like that. He's just a guy that's just wants to fight crime. I think most heroes in comic books aren't masterminds. They aren't utopians. But Batman is one of the few superheroes the good guys that is a utopian.
That's a great point, because I would definitely say that Batman's two flavors of villainry are either tyrants who want to impose some sort of fascistic order, or they're insane people who believe that morality is just a trick of the mind, and they're like Nietzschean villains. They live for their own desires. Whereas, like, for the most part, Spider-Man heroes tend to be scientists who've become animalistic versions. Like Dr. Octopus, in many ways, is simply Spider-Man if Peter Parker never grew a human conscience. Or Venom is Spider-Man if Spider-Man was a villain. But Spider-Man normally just fights either very greedy characters who just want to make a lot of money, crime bosses, or just versions of himself if he took the wrong moral path. And Batman doesn't really fight a lot of greedy people. And Batman is really dealing with external societal villains, whereas I would argue Spider-Man is dealing more with doppelgangers for the most part, variations of himself that he needs to cleanse from his own personality. So I would argue Batman is fighting a war to improve society as utopianist, and I think Spider-Man, Peter Parker, is fighting to improve himself, and by doing so, improve all of us. It's a almost apolitical view of society, because there is no politics in that universe.
Well, Spider-Man's not concerned with those sorts of issues, I think.
Which makes him prey to people who are authoritarians, and that's an interesting side point. Randall, I think this is actually a good place to end part one of Batman versus Spider-Man. I think that the particular things that we've covered here right now they kind of all match up. We're about to cover the second half, where we're going to go into a bit more things. We're going to deal with things like the other mediums they've been in, and we're going to deal with the bigger questions at the end. So I hope you come back for the second part of that. Until then, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
Thanks for listening. Bye.